So I end up in Afghanistan. I'm there for most of 2003 to early 2004. December 10th of 2003, I get wounded in action when the Taliban and Al-Qaeda tried to just have a hostile attack, try and, poke holes in the base, basically the whole 9 yards. So I get hit with a 107 millimeter rocket, and I know your guys can't really see this, but I'll show it for you. This is a portion of what I got hit with that I smuggled back, so you can just kind of see it.
Hello everyone, welcome again to Reevaluate with me, Fola. Having done a few monologues on this channel, I've been able to establish a seamless workflow and a functional one, in fact. So I reckon that it's a good time to transition into inviting guests to the podcast. So today, I have the honor of talking to a gentleman, a military veteran. He is a recipient of the Bronze Star, Purple Heart, and 2 Army Recommendation Medals. He served in Iraq and Afghanistan, mostly under the Civil Affairs and Psychological Operations Command of the U.S. Army. On returning home, he began work in geopolitical intelligence and then moved into mental health, certified in critical response, trauma care, and suicide prevention. He continues to work with veterans since then. A prolific communicator, he has also written several articles on masculinity, the military, relationships, and faith, and some of them have gone viral on social media, and his essays are featured regularly on Medium. His book, Where Cowards Go to Die, chronicles his time in war and personal struggles to readjust, and was released in July 2022 to critical acclaim. Benjamin Sledge, it's such an honor to have you as my first guest on this podcast, and I am looking forward to the conversations today, unpacking the gritty documentary that you put into your book and some of the quite graphical things that you mentioned in the book as well. So it's an honor to have you, Benjamin, on the podcast today.
Honored to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Right. Okay. So talking about, embracing fears and everything associated with that. Let's go into your experience as a military man. Mm-hmm. And like you said, still in the blood, you see it here and there, even at home. So you detailed your experience about the war in Afghanistan and that also in Iraq. So for the sake of listeners who haven't read your book like I did, I had a good read of your book, and I must say I really appreciate the effort you put into that. You kind of pulled the reader into your experience, as crazy and chaotic as it looks, just like any war. But you pull the reader into the experience. You acknowledged here and there the inadequacies about wars, about battles, about the soldiers, and the entire experience. I really appreciate that. So can you talk about the timelines when you were in Afghanistan and Iraq, by the way?
Sure. I'll just give you a very brief overview. I joined the military in 1999, so that'll date me. So that was a peacetime army under Bill Clinton. So President Bill Clinton at the time. 9/11 happened. The towers fell on 9/11. By September 25th, I was on a airplane to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, which is now called Fort Liberty. They changed the names of it, but I'm going to call it Fort Bragg for the sake of just that's what it was while I was there.
Right.
And I just have a tendency to revert back to that. So I go to Fort Bragg. I go through the John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center in school. I come home for 3 months. I get orders for Defense Language Institute in Monterey Bay, California, where I learned Spanish. even though we're fighting a war in Southeast Asia and the Middle East. So that's because at the time they hadn't restructured command, and we didn't think we were going to be fighting there forever. So I had a choice of Spanish, French, or Portuguese because we fall under the Southern Command. And so it was a lot of missions in like Colombia, Venezuela, stuff like that. I get out of language school, and at this point it's 2002. I'm home for 3 months, and then they tell me, hey, you're going to Afghanistan. And we had just invaded Iraq. So I thought for sure I'm going to Iraq.
Right.
And they're like, nope, Afghanistan, the other part of the unit's going to Iraq. Let's go. So I end up in Afghanistan. I'm there for most of 2003 to early 2004. December 10th of 2003, I get wounded in action when the Taliban and Al-Qaeda tried to just have a hostile attack, try and poke holes in the base, basically the whole 9 yards. So I get hit with a 107 millimeter rocket, and like I know your guys can't really see this, but I'll show it for you. This is a portion of like what I got hit with that I smuggled back, so you can just kind of see it. It did some damage. So out of that, I chose to stay there and finish out my tour where I just handled radios and carted around interpreters. Came home, and then about a year and a half later, I found myself missing war, and this was after dealing with a lot of post-traumatic stress and moral injury. And I was like, I'm never going back overseas again. And I end up in the guy I had mentioned earlier, Paul Gonzalez, is like, hey, we're putting together a special team. We're going to some hellhole in Iraq. I was like, not doing it. And he was like, we're all going. You should go. And so, with veterans and military, it's like, if there's a question your parents ask you, it's like, if all your friends were jumping off a bridge, would you do it? And the answer is supposed to be, of course not. But when it's your friends that you've served in combat with, you're like, all right, I'll go with you. So by the end of the day, he knew he had me, and I sign on. And at that point, I'm a team sergeant in the Civil Affairs Detachment. And I handpick my team, and we make our way to Ramadi, Iraq, which at the time is the most violent city on earth. From 2006 to 2007, it accounted for half of all deaths that happen in the United States Marine Corps and half of all attacks that happen daily in the country of Iraq. So imagine, okay, there's Baghdad, there's Mosul, there's Basra, all these cities, right? And they're having different attacks all over them. Half of all the attacks that are happening in the country are just coming out of the city that I'm in. So it was just a very nutty time period because of a violent insurgency. ISIS is standing up there. And out of that, we just kind of entered the meat grinder for the next 15 months. And it's a just wild West experience. And everybody and their dog was there. It was like Chris Kyle, Jocko Willink, Marcus Luttrell. Luttrell, and I was on Luttrell's podcast recently. You probably remember him most from Lone Survivor and the movie that came out of that. But he was there too. Like that's where he went after Operation Red Wings, and he was like, "Oh yeah, that place was awful." And so to have the guy who like survived like being basically a POW and all types of stuff, say, "Oh yeah, that was a really bad environment." It's kind of like validating to you to be like, "Yep, it was bad." So, and then after that, I came home, and unfortunately, wife left while I was in Iraq. It was college sweetheart, and I was forced to figure out what I was going to do with my life and figure out, how to live again. Because at that point, I had pretty much spent most of my 20s in Afghanistan and Iraq, and I was like, oh my gosh, all I know is slinging lead. And that does not translate well to a resume.
Right.
What have you done for the last decade?
Right. I'm sure the employer will be scared to death.
Yeah.
Right. So you altogether, I think you spent about a 5-year period fighting in battles, right?
Yeah,
right.
It was about 4 years.
About 4 years. Okay. So you were wounded in Afghanistan, and in the book, I think in the first chapter of the book, which I found really, um, it was really dramatic the way you introduced the book. At some
That
point, I
was the
was
point.
wondering, like, I was like, what else is left to read in this book right now? If this is chapter one,
Yeah. Gotta hook your
but then,
ears, you know?
right. I think that was a really good bait. So you were wounded in Afghanistan. If I
Mhm.
remember well, the diagnosis that you got was a concussion. You lost a colleague, or no, you had a colleague that was wounded that you
Mhm.
described how you had to carry him out of the line of attack. And one key phrase you used in chapter one was that I froze.
Mhm.
And there it's like you hold yourself accountable, taking responsibility for uh, what had happened to your colleague in battle. Like, can you describe that experience again when you say I
Yeah.
froze?
Yeah.
Right.
So, the reason I started out with that, I tell this story a bajillion. Everybody wants to know how you got wounded in action, you know. So I'm like, we're
Right.
just going to start there. We're going to knock that out. And plus, you know, it's dramatic, like you said. So when they were attacking the base, they were launching in 107 millimeter rockets, and they had a spotter. And a spotter is typically, you know, from a sniper team, but you can use them on large payloads of artillery as well. And they were packing them with additional explosives like C4. Sometimes they would use white phosphorus, which just burns. You can't put it out with water. And sometimes they would shoot that at the base. So we didn't know what was hitting him, but it was additional explosives.
Hmm.
So it made them wildly inaccurate. So they used a spotter to use this process called walking them in. So where they would adjust fire, and they're like, oh, you know, it landed here outside the base, adjust by, you know, whatever. They launch another one, it goes in. And they knew where all of our bunkers were. So my job, and his name is Max, and I'm using air quotes. He's still in the Joint Special Operations Command. We're still super close friends. Actually, going skiing in December together to celebrate the 20th anniversary of us getting wounded in action. Can't believe it's been 20
Right.
years. So, anyways, they start walking these in. We're trying to get these local Afghans to safety, and we're the last two that don't make it through this door where we would eat. And so we take 107 millimeter shrapnel to, mine's all superficial, lower back, wrists.
Hmm.
He gets hit through a major artery in his tricep, and starts bleeding
Right.
out. The concussive blast threw me head first into a wall, and it shattered my right wrist. And then at the time they called it a concussion. They're like, yeah, it's probably a mild concussion. They kept me up all night because that used to be the procedure. You're not supposed to do that anymore. Now we know it as traumatic brain injury. It's the same stuff that happens to football players. It's where your brain gets
Right.
literally rattled around inside your head. So like
Right.
after the attack, like weird stuff was happening for me to where everybody's making fun of me because this is just the military culture. But I couldn't pair white socks and black. I kept pairing white socks and black socks together, which is a key symptom of a traumatic brain injury. And I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't figure out why. But anyway, so that happens, and Steve gets injured, and we end up having to drag him to safety, and he's bleeding out, and my training kicks in, and I'm like, okay, we gotta go get the medics. So I tell the other guy, I'm like, hey, stay here with him. Keep patching him up, and I run out the back door. They just erected this
Hmm.
wall where triage was supposed to be, and another rocket comes slamming in, and that's when the fear took me, because before I was
Right.
just running on muscle memory, and it finally like clicked in my head. This is it. We're gonna die.
Mm.
Um, and that's really when it took me. My hands start to tremble. I burst back in the room. Um, my friend's just, he looks awful. You know, he's Casper the ghost. He's asking for water, which you don't do. It's going to send him further into shock. And I
Right.
know that if I'm going to save his life, I have to run out to the area where I just got blown up, and I can't do it.
Right.
And
Right.
so I look at the other soldier who's with me, and I say, "It's your turn to get blown up." Yeah, and so I froze. And everybody wants to be the big hero of their story in war, but nobody tells you like sometimes you're there. And the crazy part was is I had been in firefights, I had been in combat before, but for whatever reason, it took me that thing. And you think that you're going to be the guy that's like, no, not me. I'm going to be Captain America, and you're not. Um,
Hmm. Hmm.
so I stayed and continued to patch him up, and was working furiously to stop the blood loss and everything. And then the other guy comes in with the medics, and we trying to start IV lines. They're shaking; their hands are shaking so bad they can't even get IV lines going too. So at that point, I realized we're all kind of terrified, and we're like, "Are we going to
Right.
make it out? Are we not going to make it out?" And luckily, the fear begins to ebb, and the training kicks back in. But at this point, I'm pretty injured, and I start going in and out of lucidity. And at some point,
Hmm.
we got him to a helicopter and got him out of there because otherwise he was going to die. Um,
Right.
so that was how it all went down. But yeah, like everyone's like,
Hmm.
well, I was like, yeah, man, I froze. So
Right.
it is what it
Right.
is.
Right. So if I switch to your book for a second here too, in page 24, you said, when I reached Kandahar, I found out Gonzo had put me up for two awards, the Purple Heart and the Army Commendation Medal with a V device. I'll skip a little there. With any medal or trophy, I imagine soldiers want them because it means that you did something that mattered or were stupid enough to make a difference. And then further down, you say, when I found out that Gonzo had nominated me, I tried to deny both awards. I'd been there on that fateful day, and they hadn't. I knew I had frozen, and I didn't even lose an arm or leg like some friends. Instead, I had logged out with a concussion, fractured wrist, and superficial shrapnel wounds. I would recover when so many others who had done far more selfless act would not.
Mhm.
And because of that, you rejected the award, or you wanted to reject the award.
Yeah, I tried. I was like, "Hey man, I'm good. Like, just a couple bumps and bruises. We're good." And then, when the word salad and then my hand swelled really bad, and plus I was covered
Right,
in blood. And I didn't really know what
right,
was going on, but even when I got to Kandahar, I was just like I felt ashamed,
hmm,
And granted, on paper, it looks really heroic. It's like, okay, you get hit, you wake up, your buddy is bleeding out, you grab him, you drag him while you're under fire, you start working on
right,
him, and then you run out under fire again, and you get blown up one
right,
more time, and that's when you kind of froze. But I still came back and I did my job. And the only thing that
right,
kept me to do it, so on paper it looks heroic,
right.
but internally you're kind of like, and I think that's
Hmm,
what a lot of people like. You read about the guys who get Medal of Honors. They're like, I don't really do anything. I just did what I was supposed to, and I was really afraid. and I think
right,
that's
right.
that's what it is. And the other thing too is just, I, after I got home from war, I started thinking about stuff. And Napoleon Bonaparte has a fantastic quote where he says, "It's amazing what you can get a man to do for a simple piece of ribbon." Like, my
True.
awards don't mean jack. Like, if you think about it, like, there's no monetary value to it for me. It's
Right.
literally metal with a ribbon, and it's like the same thing as a trophy.
But it's interesting the way you look at that compared to the way the average one of us will look at awards. People
Mhm.
die to get awards. People
Yeah,
pay, people bribe, and commit all kinds of atrocities just to get awards.
it's true.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so it's interesting that you looked at your award like that. So, like, if I wish there's a lot of time, I would have also talked about some of the things that you wrote about the war in Iraq when you were there. You fought at Ramadi, which
Mhm.
was the epicenter of um, Islamic insurgency at that time.
Yeah.
And in fact, when I stumbled on that portion in your book, I was like, oh, goodness, I didn't know you fought in that. I don't know, I missed that in your Medium articles. I think that was the war where, for the first time, um, what was that? I think it was the purple bomb attack or something that was used for the first time in history. Is that correct?
No, they used Iran was using explosive form penetrator devices where they would just literally rip through up armored Humvees, and that was like the first time we did that. I mean, and honestly, I'm sure we'll get into this. We're right back where we were with everything going on in the Middle East right now, specifically the Levant area with Israel and the Gaza Strip and Hamas and all of that. Like, I mean, they're basically between like Fallujah and Ramadi, just being intense urban centers of warfare that are famous battles now that lasted, Fallujah was a couple months long battle. Ramadi lasted like a year and a half. I mean, it was just because you're going house to house, you're taking over houses, you're clearing out insurgencies, you're flipping guys. We flipped this guy, Sheikh Zatar, and really like it was a different environment. Like, and that's the thing that I try to explain to people with regard to Iraq and Afghanistan. My whole background is, especially in the civil affairs community, is basically becoming a geopolitical expert, understanding how geography, history, demographics, and culture dictate the political landscape, the foreign affairs of a country. And Afghanistan, it's like, you go over there and it's like progress stopped in the 1500s. It's like after Alexander the Great marched through there, it was like progress stopped. So very, very tribal, except for in Kabul, but everything else is tribal. They're still living in huts. They're still, they're still farming. There's goats and shepherding. And you're just like, wow, this seems very biblical era. So it's very different in that regard, especially if you're out on the borders and area. Again, this is negating Kabul and Bagram. But that's the vast majority of the country. And they speak multiple languages there because they're on the border with Pakistan. So you have Urdu, you have Pashtun, and you have Dari. There's a little bit of Arabic because of, they border Iran, but that's over in that area. So totally different. And then you move to Iraq and it's like all progress stopped in the 1970s. It's like stepping back in a time machine into the 70s because Saddam Hussein took over during that time period. So when you go into that environment, you're like, oh man, this is way different. We're not fighting mountain terrain warfare. We're going house to house. We're going down major roads and thoroughfares where there are, signs, the whole 9 yards telling you where to go. There are people, there are apartment complexes. It's nasty, and you're wondering, okay, who's my enemy? Who's my friend? Who's my enemy? Who's my friend? And it's difficult. And now, we're looking right back at the lens of Israel having to deal with the same stuff there. So Ramadi, was just nutty.
Right. Yeah, that's an infamous battlefield, even till date, right?
Yeah.
So let me ask this question to you, a little bit on the political side.
Sure.
Just before we transition into talking about the war in the Middle East right now. So you fought in Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm.
A large portion of your person was captured in Afghanistan, and you wrote extensively about that. The battle in Afghanistan ended a year ago. My goal with this question is not so much of politics as much as your perception.
Yeah.
So it ended about a year ago. There was an exit from Afghanistan. Depending on which camp you are politically, you will call it a glorious exit, almost like Jesus, riding a donkey into Jerusalem. Or you could call it a really dismal experience, a very shameful one. But you, coming from the military perspective, especially first-hand experience in Afghanistan, how would you describe that? What came to your mind?
I'll tell you what what the majority of us feel. There was a relief. It was like, fine, it's over. It's finally over. And then a massive disappointment. So,
Mm.
and, a friend of mine really put it in perspective. He was like, it's like a girl you dated that was super toxic that like set all your clothes on fire and threw them out the window, but you can't stop thinking about her. and it's
Right.
wrong. And like that's the thing for me. It was an embarrassment in so many ways. But here's the thing: we all knew it was going to end catastrophically. I just didn't think it was going to end as catastrophically, and neither did the CIA analysts, neither did any of the geopolitical analysts that were out there. We all thought, okay, we'll slowly withdraw, and then in a couple months, the army's going to roll over because like that's what they do. And then the Taliban will probably take over, and that'll be that. But we thought for sure we're going to have time to get our people out, and we didn't even leave the country in a show of force. Like we left like
Right.
as a dog with its tail between its legs. We literally could
Right.
have told the Taliban, "Hey, like shut up. We're going to get our people. We're going to do what we want, or we know all your positions. We're going to drone strike you." And could have put like the fear of God of them. And instead, we ended up killing civilians. Like we did a
Right.
retaliatory strike that killed civilians. And then our own people got killed. And so it was just an embarrassment on both sides. The way the Biden administration handled it was an international embarrassment, in my opinion. But also at the same time, should we have been there as long as we were? No.
Right.
And we needed to leave. So it's hard. It's at both end. It almost seems paradoxical in that form. But I think we could have handled it much better. I think there was a lot of things that could have been done a lot differently. But it was devastating for a lot of us who fought there, especially the way that it paralleled Vietnam. If you like look at the photos with the fall of Saigon and then the fall of Kabul, it was like
Right.
identical. And it was like people were trying to get the last flight out of Kabul. People were trying to get the last flight
Right.
out of Saigon. And I remember I called one of my Vietnam buddies, and we would have dinner every Sunday, and I'm wandering the house at like 3 a.m, and it just going through my head because again the wars are finally done with. The GWAT, the global war on terror, is over, and so all the stuff that I'd been unconsciously holding in just kind of came bubbling out, and I called him, and I said, I think I understand how you finally feel. And
Mhm.
he goes, yeah, you do. And he goes, and I'm sad you had to experience it too.
Right. Especially when you look at the servicemen also who lost their lives,
Mm.
right about the time when they were exiting Afghanistan. I don't think there's any way anyone in their right mind will look at that and feel great and call that a proof of strong, decisive, visionary leadership. Not a chance. Yeah, much more to a serviceman that fought through that war. Yeah.
And I think that's the thing that I remind people, it's difficult when you're like, look, I'm proud of my service. I'm not really proud of the way things went down all the time. Um,
Right.
and for me, it eventually just became about fighting for the guys next to you. Politics
Hmm.
be damned and all of that. It really just became about the men that you were serving beside. And,
Right.
that's what happens when old white dudes like make policy to protect their foreign investments and stuff. Like, young men die. Like, and it's usually the blue collar and working class that pay the high price of that. Like you look at like how we recruited specifically during the global war on terror, and it was out of the southern states. Like all the data, all the empirical data shows that we recruited specifically out of the southern states, and
Right.
we had them foot the bill because we didn't want to do a draft because it would have become an immensely unpopular war in both Afghanistan and Iraq. And
Right.
so I think what we really did when people say, hey, how do you feel now? It's like, well, I'm proud of my service. But one of the things that they ask me, they go, well, do you feel you fought for freedom? And I'm like, well, for Afghans and Iraqis, maybe not. Like for little girls to get an education and go to school, sure, 100%. And to end human rights violations and other gross injustices that I saw, I believe we did some of those things. Did we screw it up in the process? Did we wound civilians? Did we wreck families? For sure. But for me, I go, the freedom really came to the American populace. There wasn't a draft. They got to be aloof in their living rooms. Like their sons and daughters, like Uncle Sam didn't come get them. And instead it was us. We just went on back to back deployments and really gave people the freedom in America to be comfortable. They didn't have to be uncomfortable. They didn't have to send their sons and daughters overseas to come home back home in boxes like in other wars past, like Vietnam and World War II and Korea.
Right.
And so out of that, without a draft, it was just us. We were holding it down for 20 years. And so that's really the freedom that I think we gave the American populace. And so it's paradoxical in so many ways.
Right. I sincerely hope it's a freedom that is going to last a while, especially when you consider that the same group of people, the Taliban's, are in charge in that area, coupled with a bunch of terrorist groups across that part of the Middle East. I really hope it's a freedom that is going to last a while before we start seeing traits of that again, especially now that you also look at what's going on the border of the United States without too much scrutiny of the people coming in. Hopefully with time we're not paying dearly for those kind of decisions again. But let me move away from this for a moment, because I know my time is limited here with you. So Israel Hamas, in October 7th, we saw that devastating harrowing experience that a lot of Israelis and even foreigners had to go through, and some still going through it. People are still in captivity. Negotiations or some kind of military operations about to start, or some ongoing already, to rescue people from being detained by a mass group. Well, you wrote about this also on Medium. You talked about the war, and part of what you described also is that it depends on the camp where you are right now. Some could look at it almost like the way some will look at the exit from Afghanistan and say, oh, it's a glorious exit. And some will say, oh, that's horrible. The same way some will say, oh, all hail Hamas, and Israel is the bad guy. And if you're on the conservative side of the spectrum, you'll probably say the opposite of that. But what went through your mind, especially knowing that you were in the civilian affairs? You call that the group that you were with during the wars. What went through your mind about the attack that was launched against Israel on the 7th of October?
Well, I mean, think about it. If it was any other country, like let's say the attack happened in Germany, right? And it was a terrorist organization.
Right.
They're going to do the same thing. Imagine Absolutely. If it happened on U.S. soil, just in the southern border.
Oh, goodness.
we would have lost our mind. And especially, we had planes run in to our towers, and it killed our men and women that way. They killed, and I mean, the reports are devastating. And Israel's done a good job because journalists have been kind of downplaying it. Like even the New York Times had to just recently apologize because they were literally buying into Hamas propaganda, which I'm like, you're supposed to be a credible entity. This is the reason why nobody trusts the media. And so Israel, they just recently held a conference and showed empirical evidence of the attacks and what happened, and video. And the journalists were appalled. There was a guy I read on Twitter, one of the journalists was talking about, one of the first images he saw was some dude just yelling Allah Akbar and using a shovel to decapitate a dead Israeli. There were babies that were burned. So imagine that happening in the United States or a European country. What do you think we're going to do? I feel like Israel has exercised a lot more restraint than like put the United States in that situation, we would have lost our mind.
Right.
We would have utterly lost our minds, and we would have just carpet bombed whatever we wanted to.
Right.
And so in that aspect, I get it. But also at the same time, this is the thing that I point out. Gaza is like the most densely populated area in the world. It's basically kind of like an open air prison, you know. And when you have like kind of that environment, the most sadistic are going to rise to power, which is what Hamas did.
Absolutely.
Their neighbors really don't care for the Palestinians. Like Egypt's like,
Egypt.
Sorry,
Right.
we're not.
Right.
We literally border you. No thanks. We don't want you. Iran's not doing anything. They view them as apostates because they're Sunni, whereas they're Shia, and so they view the Palestinians as pretty much on the same level as animals. You have Jordan, which is almost a satellite state of Israel. You have Lebanon and Hezbollah, and of course they're going to do their own little thing, but it's irrelevant. Syria's in civil war. Nobody's going to take the people from Gaza. And so I think that says something. That would be like a bunch of Christians being like, sorry that, there's persecution going on in Mexico. Like, let's say that was the case. But we're not going to take them into our churches. Sorry about you. Kind of thing. That's good. So I go, man, what's going on here? But at the same time, 50% of the population in the Gaza Strip is like young, and it's women and children. And so those are innocent people, and it's not Hamas, but you have to wonder what's going to happen when Israel goes in. It's the same thing that we kind of did in Iraq and Afghanistan. We took people who would have normally been for us and turned them against us because of the way that we handled the situations over there. So I don't think there's any good options. Innocent people are going to die. And like, that's the tough part about war that the civilian populace doesn't get. Like we romanticize. Oh my God, do we romanticize it? Like World War II, we're like, oh, such a good war. Like we took out the Nazis. I'm like, did you see what happened to Europe? Have you seen the photos? It looks exactly like what's going on in the Gaza Strip. Do you remember how we had POWs and tortured each other during World War II? Like we literally tortured. And then sometimes we just killed each other just because we're like, I don't want to deal with the prisoner stuff. So, war crimes nonstop. But we're like, oh, it's such a good war. I have, it's so funny. I have my grandfather's stuff from World War II, and I have his leave pamphlet from Paris. And on the map, is like where all the GIs can go to get checked for venereal disease. Nobody talks about that. They're like, oh, they're hooking up with French prostitutes and everybody has VD, over there. So, and so with enough time and distance, we'll romanticize something. But when it's up close and personal, like it is now, and we go, oh, that's ugly. Oh, that's terrible. And it is. That's the tough part. But that's the thing is war is ugly. And it's some weird part of human nature that we're never going to seem to get over unless we destroy ourselves in some way, shape, or form. And so for me, I very much care for the innocent lives that are being lost in Gaza because of a terrorist organization that's done what it does. And I don't have a solution to it. I don't think there are any good solutions. I don't know where you put those people. And I think Israel's kind of trying to do the best that they can by turning on water in the south, so that they can focus on the northern area and kind of clear that out. But honestly, I think it's just going to be another Ramadi Fallujah bloodbath.
Right. So you mentioned there in passing that the people that suffer the most in war, the women and the children, the most vulnerable, the old, the aged also are the ones who suffer the most. And they are the ones, the same category of people that suffer the most. In fact, in any violence, in any economic hardship, in any even natural disaster, they tend to be the one that suffer the most. You can draw parallels in several communities across the world. But recognizing that, especially I think part of what you had to do during the wars, from what I gathered in your book, was how to, as much as possible, mitigate the impact of wars on civilians. But now you look at Hamas, he has taken the direct opposite of that, right? I think the media, depending on whichever channel you watch now, has talked about Hamas using civilians as shields
That's what they
to
do.
protect
Yeah, it's their
himself.
tactics.
Right, right. And you also talked about this in your book, where I think one of the things you referenced is using civilians, in fact, children, to ferry weapons to lay ambush for people during the war, especially the military men. So, considering that Hamas is using that tactic right now, and I think about 2,000 men from the United States are going to be deployed into that zone if they're not deployed already. I haven't seen the news today. What do you think that would imply, and how could that possibly help with the situation with the human shield tactic that Hamas has employed in this case?
What Hamas is doing effectively is they're going to garner regional support and international sympathy by doing that. They're like, oh, look at how horrible this is. And that's where they hide, in civilian infrastructures, hospitals, schools.
Right.
There's apparently just tunnels all throughout. We're talking about, this is going to be a level of scale of something that we haven't seen since like the Vietnam tunnel rats. You know, it's going to be a rat war is basically what it boils down to. At the same time, the best people to fight this war is us, unfortunately. Like, we spent 20 years in the Middle East doing counterinsurgency operations. We can go into that place and mess it up real quick. We know exactly what we're doing because we developed all of it. And so what we're seeing is more of our special operations teams that are going to be more, I think we're going to step out and say, you know, we're going to get our people out because Americans do not like their people being touched, period. And we've already seen that some of the Delta Force guys are over there, and I'm fairly certain like SEAL Team 6 is on their way. They'll probably do some amphibious landing. I think we'll get our people out and then we'll advise and assist the same way that we're doing in Ukraine against the Russians. And, you know, you already saw that Biden's sending the international aid package, but I think it's going to be a bloody rest of struggle. And how do you root out? I mean, that's the thing. We're like, we defeated Al-Qaeda, ISIS, ISIL, AQIM, which is Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb. You know, it shifted. It's like a hydra. You cut the head off one and just three more grow in its place. And so part of me wonders, like, okay, what's the end game here? How does this end? And instead, the poor, the marginalized, the innocent are going to suffer within this. So I think within the U.S. military capabilities, we are effectively going to see just kind of less interference. We're going to get our people out. We're going to be like, these are our people, and we're coming in, and if you screw with us, we're going to kill you. And we'll be very effective at it because these guys have fought there. And then I think we'll leave, and then you're just going to have like your Green Berets kind of do your advise and assist of Israeli forces. But the Israelis have battled there for forever, and the IDF know what they're doing. So no good options.
So do you think there's a room for diplomacy there, or this is all battles and combats that they have to face in that part of the world right now?
You know, I think that's the tough part. Everybody's got an opinion, you know, as far as like what's going to go down. Mm-hmm. I can only forecast based on what I see, sifting through misinformation, and then understanding like history and politics of the area. You know, everyone's doing the saber rattling thing as far as World War III, and I just go, man, I'm so tired. I'm so used to hearing this. Remember when Trump took out Soleimani from Iran, and we're like, World War III, here it comes. Trump started World War III. It's always the same thing. Russia invaded. We're like, World War III, World War III. And I'm just like, I just don't think there's enough regional support and power players in the area to start this. Like, because who's gonna come to Hamas's aid? They're a terrorist organization. Like, is it going to be Iran? We froze all their money. They're going to want their money, and they view them as apostates. So I think they're going to kind of play with us and figure out where the hostages are. Syria, like I said this earlier, none of the regional power players are going to do anything. Like, who has the power to do anything to, one, stop Israel, and then two, the United States backing them, like how's it going to turn into World War III? Who's launching the nukes? Like the only way
Right.
that any of this gets crazy is if China just suddenly is like, yeah, let's go, and they're so busy focused on Taiwan. I bet they're glad that we're busy and the U.S. Eye of Sauron's like back on the Middle East, and they're like, oh,
Right.
we'll deal with
Right.
the South China Sea. We've got other stuff that we want to do. Russia's probably glad about that too, because then they can focus in on Ukraine. And when
Right.
you keep the United States distracted from basically playing world police, it allows kind of more liberties with these other countries. I don't think they want to enter that fray. So
Right.
the saber rattling stuff that I keep hearing, I just think is ridiculous.
Hmm. Right. I agree with you on a lot of that assertions that you made there. So I also saw that, of course, there's been a lot of emotions about this war, just like there's a lot of
Oh
emotions
yeah,
about just anything in our time. I saw on the news the other day that the United States senators went into Israel, and specifically, if I remember well, I heard Lindsey Graham, the senator from South Carolina, talking about the role of Iran in this insurgence. And I think what has bewildered many is considering I think you call it the gold standard that Israel has about
mm-hmm.
intelligence. How did this, slide or pass by the United States intelligence, Israeli intelligence, and nobody knew about this before it came? I think Anthony Blinken mentioned that also, that he didn't think that Iran had
No,
a prior knowledge about Hamas's attack on the 7th of October. And you talked about that in your Medium article. Let me ask that question to you. What did you think about that?
sure. So one of the things that I think, when you have the United States Department of Defense and then SecDef and everybody else going, this seemed to have caught Iran off guard. We have no evidence that they were in any way, shape, or form involved. So I reached out to my contacts in the community and was like, "Hey,
Right.
man, like, how did this happen?" Like, and they were like, "The chatter that we've all heard is that they went dark." And when we say went dark, that means they went back to old spycraft methods. Like they were using non-digital means of communication. They're practicing radio silence. They're having face-to-face meetings because everything that you do can be tracked like anywhere
Right.
now, especially with like
Right.
Israel being the gold standard of the intelligence community in the US. It's like you swipe a
Mhm.
credit card, your phone's always listening. You've got everything that tracks you repeatedly. Even when your
Right.
phone's off and it's still in your pocket, it's still tracking you. So
Right.
one, they're probably having to use like burner phones if they did anything. Probably not. They probably went straight face-to-face meetings. They probably passed intelligence through paper means that they then burned afterwards. They're kind of that burn after reading
Mhm.
ideology. And there's kind of some speculation and reports as to, is this a new faction of Hamas that we're seeing, like a younger generation
Right.
that is more
Right.
savvy to understanding that digital era, that is effectively realizing like that's how they can get this information. So it totally took them by surprise to where they had all these people. And I'm sure that in the same way that we enforce the structures and standards with severe punishment, they probably did the same. And my
Mhm.
guess, this is totally conjecture. I know nothing. This is 100% speculation and guess. But all it takes is making one example of one dude. So like, let's say one dude like even just kind of slipped up a little bit. Hamas is a terrorist organization. They don't care. They probably killed that dude. And then it towed the line for everybody else. And then they were able to have that successful and surprise invasion. And so it just caught everybody
Right.
off guard. And it shows that,
Right.
um, you know, there are still ways around the system. You're not immune to it, which I think is a huge wake up call to the United States. That's why Biden has suddenly shifted his focus to the U.S. southern border between Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, in order to shore that place up, which will work as kind of a partisan deal, especially as they're working out the budget. So that's really, I think people are fearful now, going, oh, if that can happen to Israel, that can definitely happen to us because we've been really lax on the border areas.
Right, right. And when you talk about that as the border, the southern border of the United States, I watched the news, and I am from a country that we have border problems. I'm from Nigeria.
Mm-hmm.
And when I see that, I think it's a very disgraceful thing that has been going on the southern border for a long time. But that's not really the topic I want to talk about today with you, as much as talking about the ongoing wars around the world. But there's no way to excuse the fact that the United States overlooked the fact that you're preparing a recipe for disaster, either in the immediate or in the near future when you have an open border.
Mm-hmm.
I am from that kind of country. Nigeria is dealing right now with Boko Haram, since forever. That has been going on, I think, since 2010, if I am correct. And that's over a decade where people have faced attacks. It's affected the economy quite significantly, to say the least. People have been killed, girls raped, impregnated, taken from their families, who will never, possibly in their lifetime, reconcile with their families again. And then you look at the West, who consider themselves, or I should say ourselves, as the standard for morality in the world, and then you open your border to such dimensions of assault, if I could say, because it looks like an assault to me coming from the southern border. It simply means you're not protecting your own. And then when you look at the possibility of terrorism and attacks that could be looming on your doors, there's no way I could excuse such. And really, I found it reprehensible, unreasonable, and almost any negative word you can use to describe that. But let's shift the focus here a little bit. The war in Russia has been drawn out for so long. I know we don't have time to go into the details about Russia. And I've looked at that war, and the question I ask myself is, goodness, how did we even get into this mess? But that's not what I want us to talk about. Maybe we'll find another time to talk about it. But is there a possibility that the war between Israel and Hamas could become such a drawn out, prolonged problem like Ukraine, Russia right now?
I think that's where it's headed, honestly.
Hmm.
Like I said, you're talking about if they do a ground invasion and
Right.
rooting out Hamas leadership while going house to house and taking over civilian infrastructures, you're going to build sympathy towards Hamas. And that way, they kind of already are, just because of the fact that, they're running out of supplies, but they're more mad at Israel when the reality is their Sunni and Shia brothers and sisters are not allowing that aid through, like, especially in, the Rafah crossing. So
Right.
I think we're not talking about like a ground invasion that lasts, a couple months. I think we're talking years. I think it's
Wow.
going to be bloody. I think it's going to be bad. And I think it's going to be ongoing. And again, I don't know what the solution is. I don't think there are any good solutions, unfortunately. And out of that, it's really, you're going to have another proxy war going on in the Middle East. You're going to have one going on in Ukraine, and God only knows what happens with Taiwan and everything going on in China. But I can tell you, the United States military right now, their number one wargaming effort is preparing against China. So
Right.
that's really where we're looking at, is large scale ground combat. And we thought we were going to have that with Russia, and then realized they didn't even have teeth. They're packing up all their convicts and basically sending them over to fight. And it's a last ditch effort for them, because they have to have the former Soviet states to even survive, just because they're basically living a frozen tundra. They have complete demographic free fall. They're walking into a failed state area, whereas like Gaza, it's terrorist operations. People that have, if you look at Hamas's founding documents, it's people that have historically and adamantly want to wipe out the Jews off the face of the earth. So we're talking about just complete massacre and genocide is what they want. So I like the point that the Israelis have made. It's like if Hamas laid down their weapons and said, "Up, we're done today," they'd lay down theirs. But if Israel laid down their weapons and said, "You know what, we're not going to pursue this," they would come right back after them. So no good options. And unfortunately that is the world that we live in right now. Is just a lot of unfortunate stuff. And now with a 24-hour news cycle. It's in the past, we were largely unaware. We had like the Iran Contra, but there are always proxy wars going on. But now it's like we're always focused. We're always on. Our attention is constantly hijacked. And I'm just like, hey, man, like it's terrible, like what's happening over in the Middle East. But like, please go outside and take a walk. Like it's not bad here in America. It's really not. You can go pet a dog. You can roll around in a park in the grass. You can go ski. And yet Americans are so short-sighted, and we love to navel gaze that we think everything is about us when it's not.
Right. Yeah, I jokingly sometimes say to my wife that when I think about the West, having lived in Africa, or I should say, having lived in Nigeria for the first part of my life, the first about 30 years of my life, I can't but think that the West is a privileged place to live in, for sure, and of course, still a land of opportunities when you consider it side by side in many places around the world. But then I also look at our lifestyle. I often like to call it an overprivileged lifestyle. You wake up in the morning, everything is fine if you're good, and like you said, you can still roll in the grass with your dog, and you feel like, oh, your house is too small, you buy another one, and you upgrade from there. You change your car almost every 5 years. You don't like the sofa in your house, you switch the color out. It's a really overprivileged life here compared to what's obtainable in several parts of the world. It is.
And we're all depressed. So, we're like, everything's great and we're miserable, and that's me talking from my mental health side stuff. And that's a conversation for another day, but yeah.
Absolutely. And I would like to go into that some other day, but I think this is a point that we can take a 10-second break and just be right back. I know you're enjoying this conversation right now and can't wait to get back into it. But if you're getting some value from this conversation, I think it's a good time to like the video and subscribe to the channel. You can also follow me at Revaluate with Fola on social media. That's on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter for more conversations like this. So let's get back into the conversation. On a light-hearted note, reading your book, I felt like, oh goodness, this is one of the few books I've read, and the F-bombs is scattered all over the place in your book. And I was wondering, just thinking to myself, that which one do you shell more in the war? Is it the F-bombs or the actual bombs?
Yeah, it's a little bit of probably the F-bomb, honestly, just the amount of soldiers. And I'm one of those guys, I'm not against cursing. I just think if you do it in public in certain places that you sound uncouth. Like, I think there's times that it's appropriate, but if you're going to write a true war story, and it's true to the military, you have to keep the language true. Right. And I knew if I didn't do that every veteran who read it would be like, he sugarcoated it. So.
Right. So do you still do extreme workouts like you said you did when you first arrived in Iraq?
Yeah. I will do more like cardio stuff. So I'm really injured these days, being in my 40s, and everything just kind of caught up with me. Like, I can't lift heavy weight anymore. We're in the process of talking with spine specialists and stuff because they're talking about me having to do a spinal fusion, and we're trying to gate that. So I have ketamine fusions once a month for chronic pain because I just don't want to be on drugs the whole time. Right. And then, just a lot more body weight, kind of lower weight that I just do in the gym now to stay healthy. So for me,
Right.
it's about staying healthy and longevity and ensuring that my core strength is still good and stuff like that. But I'm not out there doing like what some of these CrossFit guys are doing anymore. I would break my
Mm,
back immediately. They'd be like, power clean and snatch
right.
this, barbell. And I'd be like, I'm done. My back is broken. So yeah.
Right. 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 So I think whenever I see you next, I probably take you up on an arm wrestling, or let's hike up the trail and see. Let's see if you're gonna
Oh, I
go up the
still
trail
hike.
like a
I
Ram
still hike.
1500 or like a Kia Picanto.
I still hike. I love hiking, but
All
I'm not
right.
wearing a back. I'm not wearing a backpack. I'm just wearing a water bladder.
Right. Finally, let me ask you some more fun questions. You can say yes or no. So, would you take a clean shave or facial hair?
Oh man,
I
would
can
I
see you
rather
still
have
have
hair
some
on top of the head or facial hair?
facial
Probably.
hair.
Man, I'm torn. I want both. I would probably take hair on top. Honestly, keep me looking young. I don't know, and maybe keep
Right.
it a little bit clean shaven. If I grew a little patchy stubble, I'd be okay with it. But I can grow a
All
beard.
right.
Yeah, you
Are you
never hear about
considering it?
male
Right.
pattern beardness.
Right. 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 Are you considering a political career?
No. I get that question all the time. People are like, "Hey, man, have you ever thought about?" And I'm just like, I don't know. I'd love to go in there and shake up the system, but I think there's too many lobbyists and crazy people that like they would. I just absolutely get slaughtered. Or I would have to
Right.
compromise my morals and principles. So nah.
Right. Right. Is being married or being single good for your mental health?
I think both. Like after I went through my divorce when my wife left while I was in Iraq, I had to learn how to be single because I had always lived with somebody. My brother and we shared a room growing up, and then I went to military, and then college and fraternities, and then it's the military, and then I got out of the military, and have to learn how to live with myself. And like
Right.
that's the thing a lot of people aren't figuring out how to do. Like one, learn how to live with yourself, but also learn how to live with somebody else. And then same
Right.
thing for being married. Being married is learning about how do you sacrifice well for the other person.
Right. Well, Benjamin Sledge, there's no way I'll thank you enough for the time we've had together talking about all these conversations today. Next time we meet, hopefully you had a good time enough to give me another opportunity with you.
Sure,
We'll
of
talk
course.
more about mental health and some of the work you're doing out there with the organizations you're involved with. But for today, I'm really grateful that you found the time out of your busy schedule to talk to me. Would you give me some last words here? You're my first guest. Is there some word of encouragement to give to me within a few seconds before you go?
Yeah, there's a phrase that I, I never know who said it. It's just kind of become my catchphrase now. A lot of people are wondering, like, what do I do with my life? We talked about purpose and everything. One of the key things that I really learned in the military was discipline. You have to be disciplined to make differences. And everything becomes muscle memory kind of at that point. You're going to practice a bunch on a weapon. You're going to practice a bunch on cadences, left, right, left. Marching the whole 9 yards. And so I use this now when people ask me like, "Hey, how did you become good at writing? How did you learn how to build websites, stuff like that?" I was like, discipline. I learned, and it sucked. Like it was not fun. Like I was terrible initially as a writer. I wrote to my cat, she was the only one who would listen to my articles. And then everyone's like, "Oh, you have this huge platform. And you've got like 50,000 followers on Medium. You got a book deal. How did that happen?" And I was like, discipline. I just kept writing. I just kept doing. I just kept honing the craft. I just kept keeping up on the latest website trends. And so people, the thing that I tell them now is I say, discipline is the defining fire by which talent becomes ability.
Discipline. Discipline. I will take note of that.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Benjamin.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.